Hello, New Haven, and welcome back to WNHHLP 103.5 FM New Haven. This is Arts Respond, a collaboration between WNHH and the Arts Council of Greater New Haven. And I am very excited to be here with Adam Matlock. Adam wears many, many hats. You are a musician, you're also a composer, you're also an environmentalist. You do a lot.
I do, yes.
You do a lot, and you're just a very bright spot in this. What we're recording on a very dreary morning. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Adam, you've been on. I think you were on Kitchen Sink, which was the sort of the predecessor to Arts Respond, talking about food and music. So you've been on the radio with me before, but today we are talking about What Riot, an opera that is, can I say it's forthcoming from you? It's sort of like in the world.
Yes, it is. It is sort of half, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, sort of. I think that's a fair way to say it.
Yeah. Which is an opera about what many now recognize as the Tulsa Race Massacre, but we will get into why the word riot is in the title, and the words massacre, riot, and rebellion all appear in the first scene of the first act, or maybe the second scene of the first act.
One of them, for sure. Yeah,
one of the two. So let's get right into it. And I'm wondering if you can take the listeners back to 2012 when you saw a post pop up. I think it was on Tumblr, right?
Correct. Yeah. So that's dating myself for sure, in terms of the particular platform of social media. But yeah, I think so at that time. I guess that was sort of like one of my kind of main uses of social media, I think, was like getting really sort of kind of a sense of history and kind of alternative scholarship. I think at the time, a lot of the people that I was connected to on that platform, besides people who were sort of in various, fans of various, IPs that I was also a fan of and stuff, were folks who were sort of like historians who were working on, sort of academic and non-academic kind of historical research. There's and a lot of it had to do with sort of correcting previous notions about racial justice and sort of like the presence of people of color in sort of Western art history and that sort of thing. And so just by the fact of being connected to all these people, that's one of the things that that platform was really good for, was sort of the reblog, right? And so if someone made a sort of historical post and put a certain amount of research into it, it was fairly easy to share it, right? And there was no character limit as there is on Twitter, right? So you could get into a lot of really good, of detail, really. The main thing that was sort of circulating was an image, and it was just a single image with some text on it that showed one of the historical photos of the Greenwood district, I think sometime shortly after, sort of in the aftermath of these events, which happened, mostly in the span of 2 days, in 1921. And, and it talked a little bit about it, and but it, it wasn't a huge amount of detail, but like sort of as it spread, people were like, oh, I know about this. Let's add on some more info to it. Let's give some more context, right? Talking a little bit more about sort of what led sort of kind of basically the events that kind of spitballed into this happening, and it really did kind of erupt in in a very sudden fashion, but it didn't erupt out of nowhere, right? So I think there was certainly a lot of context that that sort of led to the area being primed for this sort of thing to happen, right? And so I guess that one thing sort of led to another. I saw this post a couple of times, just because it, that people would keep sort of resharing it, and occasionally it would have sort of new layers of info in. And at some point that led me to the Wikipedia page, which was actually, I think, quite detailed at the time, and had a pretty I would say a pretty narrative account of, of sort of what happened. And I think that's not an accident, right? I think that, sort of like everything that we know, that we knew even then about it, I think it was like, it was very sort of, it seemed to unfold in a way that was very kind of like it was a narrative already, right? It was not just sort of like a collection of events that then people put a spin on, right? The way it sort of unfolded out of a kind of like interpersonal interaction, right? And then, sort of like spitball to include the entire district of the city and, many people outside of it as well. I think it's, I think I described it as being dramatically primed in a sense, right? And
right,
and it feels very tragic the way it sort of unfolded because but of course if you know like much at all about the history of this country, right, it is not an isolated incident in terms of the sort of fear of like white femininity being sort of threatened by Black masculinity to some
right.
degree. And of course, that's a really complicated statement that needs a lot of unpacking too. But
also, yes, yeah.
but historically, like that has been a big driver for a lot of racist actions and policies in this country, and especially here, that seemed to be the case. So
yeah. So I want to step back from it a little bit, and for
Sure.
listeners who maybe are not familiar with the story of Greenwood, and I will say there are many Greenwoods across the United States, right? And I think that was one thing that really stayed with me. So 2 weeks ago, you had a sort of a listening, I don't want to call it a listening party. Because that sounds really festive, and like no one was like wearing birthday hats and eating popcorn and blowing on whatever they're called, streamers or
vuvuzelas or something.
Right. It was like a really contemplative event, I think, and but a listening session and sort of listening and feedback to the first act. But for folks who maybe haven't heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre, the Greenwood Massacre, can you take them a little bit through the inciting incident? Because that was something that I had heard this term while reporting, especially earlier this year. New Haven had its own Black Wall Street Festival, and that was partly paying homage to Greenwood and to other sort of booming Black business districts that were self-sustaining in the first half of the 20th century. But I think a lot of folks don't actually know about the inciting incident behind this and what it says about how quickly an event can spiral. And also, I want to get into talking about the complicity of the media as a right-wing institution, but we can save that for a little later.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think what we understand to be sort of the catalyst for this event was, it was two people in an elevator, right? And so the man was Dick Rowland. At least that's my understanding of the pronunciation of his name. He was also known as Diamond Dick, and he was a shoe shine in the area, in Greenwood, and. So I think that basically, like, even though the area was, had its own sort of like booming Black business district, there was still, active segregation. There was still, some Jim Crow laws in effect. And so, what we understand is that he was not able to use the bathroom anywhere, just anywhere, like as we, understand bathrooms were segregated as a result of this. And so, there was an arrangement with the owner of a nearby building, which the Drexel building, and he, the boot blacks were able to use the bathroom there. And so on one day he went to go and use the restroom, and there was a young white woman who was operating the elevator. Her name was Sarah Page. And and once the door shut, we really don't know what happened, right? But the understanding, at the very least, is that he was accused of assaulting her in that elevator. And once that accusation sort of spread around, he was arrested, right? And oftentimes there, was a history of sort of complicity between the law enforcement institutions and white supremacists, clans people, or other strains of white supremacists. Who would participate in the extrajudicial murders of Black men who were accused of such things. And, whether it was lynching or something else, right? And there was a history of that in Oklahoma as much as there was, all across the American Southeast, and other places too. So, and so basically, like, this accusation spread around. Dick Rowland was arrested. It was pretty well believed that a mob was coming to sort of take him out of the jail and to kind of surreptitiously lynch him, as we understand. But at that point, that had happened enough times in recent memory for the people of Tulsa, for people who were just aware of what was going on in the area, that people really were just not going to let it happen. Like the Black people who lived in Greenwood, many of whom were veterans, many of whom had fought for the country in World War I, and then come back to Jim Crow and come back, to relative prosperity in Greenwood, but still, being constantly reminded of their place in American society, had sort of decided that just didn't sit with them. And so what they were going to do is arm themselves and prevent it from happening at all costs. And so, basically, this sort of led to ultimately, a kind of intense standoff and confrontation at the police station, where people were coming to make sure that Dick Rowland was not going to be, taken out of the jail while another mob showed up to sort of make that happen. And so, these two large groups of people, an incredible amount of tension, all of the sort of loaded stuff that happened. And, it's we don't really know how the conflict actually went from the simmer to the boil in that way. But, it's believed that a gun went off, and with that level of tension, it turned into, kind of a battle, basically. And then at that point, of course, the historical record becomes a lot hazier, right? Because, it was really kind of a crisis situation. And so what we have is, we have an official account. We have what the newspapers were reporting, some of which were Black-owned newspapers, who obviously were invested in representing what they felt was the truth, which was not being reported by other newspapers, which were we're kind of perpetuating the narrative of Dick Rowland's assault of Sarah Page, and and sort of bandying that about as a justification for anything that happened to it. So we see a lot of these things again. There are sort of patterns of this happening. So, but and then within sort of 24 to 36 hours, the whole Greenwood area was razed. It was largely burned to the ground. A lot of homes, a lot of businesses, etc. So,
and people died. I mean, that is and not that the loss of property is deeply upsetting and messed up. I'm not going to use a certain word because I don't want to get in trouble with the FCC. But there was also the loss of human life.
Correct. Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that's. Although it's interesting that you say that, because I think that when it was first sort of introduced to me, one of the things that made it stand out was not just the loss of life, because that was unfortunately pretty commonplace, but it was the fact that there was like an economic foothold for Black Americans in this district, right? And that was completely wiped away within the span of 36 hours. So yeah, I mean, I think both obviously, yes, both of them are extremely significant parts of this, and I think that when I was introduced to it, and of course since being introduced to it, learning that it was more of a pattern and all that, that it was a bit more sort of commonplace in terms of that being a sort of white supremacist reaction to Black Americans sort of gaining any kind of economic or political traction. in, when just recently they had been enslaved, like within some people's lifetimes, so I think, that was the thing that was emphasized as I was introduced to this, was the fact that there was the beginning of a chance to build something like generational wealth, which we now, I think, understand as being a pretty big part of the current and ongoing racial disparities, in this country, and that was wiped away. So I think that's a pretty crucial part of it as well.
Yeah. So I do want to ask you where you are emotionally after writing the first and part of the second act, all of the second act.
I have not. So the second act has not been written musically yet. The libretto is basically almost done, and that is being written by Brian Slattery, who also wrote the first act. Yes. And we're going to go back and do some revisions before the music gets started. But also, I do plan to kind of revise some of the music for the first act. Just due to the circumstances, of not really being able to sort of convene an ensemble for during the period when I was working on this. So yeah, there's
and shout out to Brian Slattery, who, in addition to being the arts editor at the New Haven Independent and a novelist, is just a really fabulous musician in his own right. And yes, we're lucky to have both of you on this. I feel like there's star power there a little bit, like introverted star power. Is that fair?
Yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah.
Is that fair? But so I want to get into the process of writing itself, because I think for a lot of listeners, they will hear a piece of music, but they don't really have a sense of how it got there. And so I'm wondering if you can take us lay people, us plebs out there, through the process of writing. And then, specifically, you've talked a little bit about the fact that, you had a grant come through from the Bitsy Clark Fund for Artists in 2019. So at that point, you had been thinking about this event and talking about this event. And my understanding is writing a bit around this event for 12, 13, 14, 15, many years. I don't do math. And but then, of course, we know what happens in 2020. Right. There is sort of the parallel pandemics of white supremacy, which is not a new pandemic or epidemic in this country, and then also COVID-19 at the same time. And we're seeing both of those play out in the first months of 2020.
Yeah. Well, okay, yeah. So I think so. I can't remember who it was, but at one point I read an interview with a living composer who said that almost every composition, it feels like starting over again. Like when you begin something anew, and I would say that this is the case for me more for things that things where I'm wearing the sort of capital C composer hat, as opposed to working as a songwriter or working as a, like an ambient artist or whatever, because I do a lot of other types of music besides this sort of like, sort of uppercase composition. And that's a distinction I'm trying to work through in my head, but anyway, it still exists. But yeah, was the feeling of that, like I had written one opera before, also with Brian Slattery as the librettist. I've done other sort of longer form compositions, but in many situations, like it took a long time to sort of figure out how to write the first note, how to sort of get a sense of what the how to sort of musically set the scene, right? And I'll say that I think the opening notes that happen in the first act, it would not have happened if I had not been like standing in a lake somewhere and like listening to the water lapping, because like there was kind of a rhythm that came through just as a result of like motorboat wave or something like that. And that, just at some point it was like, well, maybe this is something that, sort of like gets a feeling of, of anxiety to some degree, like, this sense of like this uneven rhythm, kind of like hitting against the rocks, hitting against, me as I was standing there. And, so that was a little bit of an inspiration for me, and I think that as much as I can, very clearly acknowledge certain musical sources and inspirations for, for the work that I do, it has been really helpful to learn to kind of see music in non-musical things, for the, in terms of trying to, just make the effort of capturing and conveying, certain things that, are not sort of inherently musical, and from there, I mean, it was kind of a really long and slow process. I wrote a lot of sketches for the scenes on paper. Several of them were discarded between, writing the initial notes and the sort of draft that was presented on in November. But yeah, a lot of it was just like trying to figure out things that sort of, to me, sort of captured the sense of tension, right? Because it was that tension, despite the sort of flourishing of Greenwood. It was that tension that sort of led to things escalating as quickly and as to the level that they did. And so then for me, like figuring out kind of a harmonic world, like what were the chords that I could just like sit down and play at my keyboard that seemed to sort of like convey some sense of tension in that way. Without getting too into the music theory stuff of it. So
I mean, you can get wonky. That's okay. People have gotten wonky on the radio before. We love that. We love a good nerding out. But yeah, and then talk me through also writing. So at this listening session a couple of weeks ago, Noah Bloom, who is the current executive director at Neighborhood Music School, where you're also an educator and an instructor, said, how did you get through writing this or something to that, like something along those lines.
Mm.
And you said, well, I took a lot of breaks.
Yeah.
But this is heavy. Like this is very heavy. And not only is this heavy, but you have lived experiences as a Black person and a Black man in America, right?
Yeah. So, I think the combination for me is that like sometimes as an artist or as a singer, especially that I can sometimes be so focused on the musical aspects of something that lyrics don't always come through for me. And there are songs that I have learned, other people's songs that I've learned where, I've sung it a dozen times or more, and it doesn't really hit me until the 13th time that what it is I'm actually singing about, or just like I think so much about like trying to navigate the musical aspects of it, that, the meaning doesn't always sort of come through. And I think that, in that happened to me as working with Brian's words in this case, right? That I knew that sort of the story, like we had both read the same books. I knew kind of the overall arc of things, but then some of the words that he chose to sort of convey what was happening didn't click to me the first couple of times that I read the libretto, and didn't click to me until certain points of revision when I was looking at and still thinking very primarily about how is this going to be sung, right? Is this going to be something that singers can easily convey? Is it within their voice ranges, that sort of thing? And those are technical problems that if you ignore them, right, then you don't always end up with as effective a piece of music. But the lyrics are as, if not more important in terms of a historical work like this, because it's they have they need to be audible, they need to be sort of singable, they need to be something that like where someone is singing them, you don't sort of lose meaning to the sort of like poetry of the form. And that is one of the things that I'm really interested in as as a sort of a student of music, is like where music and narrative sort of overlap in that way. It's something I think a lot about as a songwriter, I think a lot about it as a listener. And I think that is one thing that sometimes modern opera does not always consider, right? Is that I think that there is a without, I'm not trying to put anybody on blast, but I think that there is like a sort of obsessiveness with the poetry of the words and with the poetry of the form that sometimes the meaning gets a little bit lost. I think that it is, I don't know. So for me anyway, it was important to like really think about not just am I writing like beautiful melodies for the singers to sing, and of course that's a big part of writing an opera that people actually want to perform, right? It's like, is it something that singers enjoy doing, right? And so I was thinking about that, and I think that's ultimately that was what made it a little bit difficult, right? Is that I was kind of planning for the posterity in some degree, to some degree. Like there was always this kind of filtration through a sense of like, how am I going to make this something that is possible to realize with other people, with other singers, with with an ensemble, and then so when as the pandemic sort of was continuing, I mean it's ongoing, but like as it was sort of stretching on, and realizing that the sort of initial period of the grant would not allow me to convene an actual ensemble to do this, we sort of agreed that the best way to do it would be to create sort of an electronic score, and then just have so we recorded in Firehouse 12 Studios, which in their room in Worcester Square, which is a very large room, so there was like enough space for singers to be pretty safely distant from one another, not facing each other. Not singing is definitely one of the riskier things as far as sort of like particle transmission and all that stuff. So but yeah, so I think then when we pivoted to sort of doing an electronic score, then I was able to kind of get a little bit away from that. Because I wasn't sort of like caught up with the sort of the mundane concerns of how this was going to be realized, except for the aspects of conveying the text. So
yeah, and as far as I asked you this at the listening session too, but the composer Joel Thompson, who New Haven is really lucky, at least in the moment, to to have in the city. I don't know, I'm thinking of the city as a living thing, and that's weird anyway. But talks about this current and voracious appetite for trauma, and specifically Black trauma and the trauma of people of color, that I think especially organizations which have historically been led by white people, some of which are still led by white people, sort of since this moment in mid-2020, we're like, whoa, we gotta do something about this racism thing that has existed in the United States for over 4 centuries. And they sort of scramble. And he has talked about the tension of producing work that he believes in, and that he believes in sort of both the narrative and the musical aspects of, and then knowing that there are certain folks who will go and either commission that work or pay for that work or show up for that work because they want so badly to feel something. And I'm interested in knowing, did you feel that tension, or is this something that you believe so deeply in sharing the history of? Because I think, Adam, you're right. You talked about how several people, many people, still don't know about this history because it's not taught in their history classes.
Yeah, I think Joel is extremely astute about that. And I am not certain that I was aware of that the whole time that I was working on it. I think I started to sort of become aware of it. And, really what, part of it was the fact that while I was working on it, these protests, that started, sort of kicked off in response to George Floyd's death, like that was that was ongoing. Like, I was working on the second and third acts, like during that summer, especially of 2020. And it took, I think part of it was that, being sort of still relatively isolated during that time, I went out to a few of those protests myself, but in New Haven, but a lot of the time I was watching things that were happening in bigger cities in New York and Los Angeles, and especially in places where police were really, showing their true colors in a lot of ways, right? In response to these protests, right? And that was, so I think that it was not exactly the healthiest thing for me, but I think it also kind of fueled, to some degree, like the way that I was writing about this, and the way that I was sort of feeling that it was not an isolated incident, right? And I had always kind of understood that what I hoped for this opera to be was to have a chance to sort of connect, to every other situation that has happened like that since. And I think that working with the stage as a medium has the chance to sort of deal with nonlinear time in a way that maybe film or even just music on its own would not necessarily be able to do. And I think that's that to me it was one of the reasons why it seemed like it had to be an opera, and a staged opera was, with that there would be the chance to sort of make some of those connections. But I 100% agree that I think, even since Kendrick Lamar winning the Pulitzer Prize for composition, for an album that was pretty confessional, it was not an album that made him look good all the time, right? And that was, regardless of how you feel about him, what I saw immediately was in classical music circles, a lot of people sort of clutching their pearls about the fact that a rap artist was winning something that was historically one of the only venues for classical musicians to get recognized, right? But then if you looked at all the past Pulitzer Prize winners for composition, there was not a lot of engagement, right? It was just, and I think there's, the classical music world is doing a reasonable amount of reckoning with that. But as you say, and as Joel pointed out, I think that a lot of that comes in the form of centering Black pain, centering, even the poetic expressions of it, right? James Baldwin was he wrote some of the most beautiful words to ever, talk about pain. And it makes a lot of people feel a lot of things, right? And are his short stories about that are not as directly focused on that, or is his poetry that focus on that, is it as popular, or is it as well known as the fire next time, or any of the more kind of direct essays where he's talking about his own experiences with police brutality or things like that? Not as much, right? And so I think there's definitely something to think about there. And and I don't blame any Black creative person for taking those opportunities, because the opportunities are so rare, and the resources are so limited, and there's so much competition for them. But I do feel that it is one of those situations where you can sort of end up kind of trapped with that, because Black creative people have so much more to say than about pain, right? I think that it seems kind of simplistic to just do kind of one-for-one comparisons, but I think when white people, artists focus only on pain, right, they're kind of described as maudlin, right? So what is the difference, right? There's definitely something in the perspective there, right, that that I think deserves a closer look, for sure.
Yeah, I think about how Madeline Syed, in a panel discussion a couple of years ago, so she is not a Black theater maker, she is an Indigenous theater maker. And on a panel a couple of years ago, she got very frustrated, and she said, I just want to write about clouds. Can someone commission me to write about clouds? And it was a really beautiful and vulnerable moment. And I go back to that a lot. Why can't we also give people money to write about? Because the concentrated wealth is out there, but that is another whole show about capitalism and the nonprofit industrial complex. So in our last couple minutes together, because I know you have a lesson and I want to be mindful of time, I want to ask you, Adam, you wear a lot of hats as a musician as well. So So not just that capital C composer, but
Mhm.
also as a musician. What are some of the projects that are giving you real joy right now? And this can be one of them, like Joy and Trauma. Dwayne Betts, his poetry feels fitting in this discussion because he is an abolitionist, and I think this opera in many ways is an argument for abolition without ever having to explicitly say the word. But he talks about holding the light and the dark together, and I think as an artist, yes, you can do that.
Yeah, I think. I think that's a very good point, because I think that when we get so caught up, this just the state of politicization in this country right now, is that people react to buzzwords, right? So if I were to say abolition, right, yeah, maybe this would be a much less popular piece, or it would have a much different reaction if it was making sort of explicit demands. And I would be remiss to point out that there is at the moment another work that I found out after I received the grant that is being composed sort of in response to the Greenwood Massacre by the composer Daniel Bernard Romain, who is has a previous New Haven connection. I think he was a composer in residence at the NHSO, did similar workshops along the lines of what Joel Thompson was doing, and he was commissioned by the Tulsa Opera to create a work for this, and then was decommissioned for it. Because his language was seen as being too incendiary, and it's kind of unclear exactly what happened. He sort of presented a version of what happened before he deleted his Twitter account, which was probably the wisest move any creative could do at this point, just for their own mental health. But so sort of he has a sort of a version of what happened that seems as though there was a particular line that singers in the opera and the opera sort of board itself objected to, which was a pretty outright condemnation of America, of an America that lets this sort of thing happen, and where this sort of thing is a regular event. So I know it's my understanding now that it's sort of being turned into a kind of a video opera piece because the support was withdrawn. And I don't know all the details of that, but so yeah, I think that one of the things that enables us to maybe avoid some of that politicization is the fact that that it's not just about the anger, right? If you want to actually understand, I think this is one of the greatest things that art can do for us, is enable us to sort of build empathy based on the fact that we are just that we're whole people, that people who are not like us have the same feelings that we do, maybe not in response to the same things, right? But that there are moments not just of pain and of bitterness and of resentment and that, but also there are moments of joy, there are moments of just mild annoyance, there are moments there's just there's a whole range of things, right? And so yeah, I think being able to sort of center the real, justified, and very deserved anger within the context of the whole person, right, is what enables it to, I dare say it, but it makes it an easier pill to swallow for people, because it's not just coming from a creature of rage that you see no other humanity in, right, but it's coming from a fellow human being, right? And I think that that is one of the things where all of my artistic experiences have led me to that conclusion, pretty much, right? That when you understand people sort of at their level, and not just from what you think it is that they understand, that there are there's a real chance for empathy and an actual sort of bridge building. And so to your question, of the other things that are sort of invigorating me, I have for pretty much as long as I've been a performer, I've been playing klezmer music, right, which is Jewish American and Eastern European Jewish folk music, that and I think that there is a pretty great history in this country, as much as there is some tension, right? There is a pretty great history of Jewish and Black American sort of support in response to sort of white supremacy, in response to to the power, the powers that would rather both of us not exist, right? And so that's a big part of it for me. I'm thinking about it a lot because, the pianist Pete Sokolov just recently passed away. He was a very important figure for a lot of klezmer, and I'm spending a lot of time reminiscing. I didn't really know him except for like I met him once at a klezmer event, but it's just like sent me down kind of like a really big memory hole of like people and experiences that were super important to me as in my development as a musician. But also I do a lot of kind of like fantasy oriented synthesizer music, and that's I previously applied for grants to kind of do that kind of stuff because I think that and did not receive them, right? And of course there's I don't want to be like spend time sort of obsessing over that stuff, but it doesn't surprise me that the like submitting an application for a grant based on a much more directly sort of political project went over better than than me doing kind of nerdy stuff, right? Where I dress up in a cloak or a night outfit or something. So but that stuff is as important to me, and just sort of my general ability to kind of engage with the world without being a terribly bitter person all the time, just because it's an outlet, right? I think like similarly being able to play with some of the bands that I played with, like Dr. Catawalls is probably the longest running band, and we've been together in various forms for about 12 years now, and it's still fun just because it gives us the chance to kind of like challenge each other and like bring in new stuff and all that. And similarly, like free improvisation is one of the the kind of big sort of factors for me. It was something that I wanted to be more of a part of this opera, because I think there is a great tradition now, especially of Black American opera composers utilizing improvisation as part of their operatic language, and that the classical music world is now sort of able to handle that without freaking out, because the players now are as well trained as they have ever been in terms of not just being able to sight read Brahms like at the drop of a hat, but that they can like have some experience playing music outside of that canon, and it enriches their experience sort of within the canon. And I think that's the sort of thing where this sort of like wearing of different hats for me as a composer, as a as a synth artist, as a as a side person in in bands and things like that, where like I have been trying to sort of undo some of that siloing. I think I did a lot of that early on because it seemed like professionally convenient to be able to have these different sides of myself to present in different contexts. But then it also meant sort of trying to actively hide some of these things from in certain contexts, and I'm not interested in doing that anymore. And it's an ongoing process of trying to undo that, and to sort of let the freak flag fly, so to speak, which is not an easy thing to say on the radio, but or any other context.
Well, I would also say I love your nerdy stuff too. So please keep doing it. Please keep digging up your front yard and growing mushrooms and posting about it online, because that is also joyful. Adam, if folks want to find you very quickly, how can they do that, and how can they support your music? Because I know it's out there.
Yeah, so if you search my first and last name, adammatlock.bandcamp.com, I have managed to figure out an index page which links to all of the, several dozen projects that I'm connected to. And so that'll have, at the very least, all of the kind of most recent releases, some of which are free improvisation, some of which are the synth music, some of which are, kind of like other compositions that I've produced and recorded over the years. So, but yeah, I that would be the best way. Awesome. I do a terrible job of keeping up a website, but also you can find me at An Historic Music on Instagram, which is where I manage to post somewhat regularly, at least, about things I'm doing. So.
Awesome. Well, Adam Matlock, I want to thank you so much for joining me on Arts Respond. I also want to do a quick plug for your arts writing in the New Haven Independent. You have been writing about the New Haven Symphony Orchestra, talking about historically white institutions. They're doing the work. They're actually doing the work. And so shout out NHSO, but also shout out your writing, because some music writing is impenetrable and wonky and yours is not. So if folks want to read about how the symphony is doing the work, go to Adam Matlock's writing, find his byline on the New Haven Independent, go support his music. artists need money. They don't do their work for free. Adam, thank you so much for joining me. And if folks want to find out more about what Riot, keep your ears open and your eyes open, because I have a feeling that there will be another chance to listen in the next year.
Yeah, at the very least, the recording that that we that was sort of played at the listening party will go up online. But that's a placeholder, right? And I'm looking forward to sort of continuing that work and doing some revision so that I can do it as initially planned with live instruments and in a live setting. So.
Awesome. Well, follow Adam Matlock. His work is good across the board. Adam, thank you so much for joining me on this dreary morning to talk about arts and artists. I appreciate you. Take care.
No, thank you for having me. Have a good one.